Greetings from Tromaville. I'm Lloyd Kaufman, president of Troma Entertainment and creator of the Toxic Avenger. We're living in an age of remakes, and Poultrygeist is a shot-by-shot exact remake of another slapstick gore movie called Schindler's List. Except that instead of the Jews, we put in the chicken Indian zombies, and instead of the concentration camp, we have substituted a far more horrible place, a fast food chicken establishment.
Welcome to Amusing Jews, where we celebrate Jewish contributors and contributions to American popular culture. I'm Jonathan Friedman.
And I'm Joey Angelfield.
Producer-engineer Mike Tomren is working somewhere behind the scenes. Amusing Jews is a project of Adat Chaverim Congregation for Humanistic Judaism, the Jewish Museum of the American West, and Atheists United Studios. Hey Joey, it's a rare privilege to explore the careers of our favorite filmmakers through their own words. Sure, historians and critics have spilled plenty of ink, documenting, analyzing, and often overanalyzing their movies, but this isn't the same as listening to the horse's mouth, or in this case, the mouth of one of the last great peppermint-stripe-suited, bow-tied showmen and entertainers in the Jewish American vaudeville style, as he's described in a delightful and informative new book.
We're thrilled to chat again with Mathew Klickstein, an author and pop culture historian whose latest book is Lloyd Kaufman Interviews, part of the Conversations with Filmmakers series of the University Press of Mississippi. Mathew, welcome to Amusing Jews.
Thank you guys for having me back again. I appreciate it.
You and Lloyd have a great rapport and share an outsider, critical, humorous, dare I say, Jewish sensibility. How did you two get to know each other?
Like a lot of kids from the 80s and early 90s, I grew up on Troma films and Lloyd's films. I watched a lot of USA Up All Night with Rhonda and Joe Bob Briggs Drive-In Theater and Skidamax, as we called it at the time. I was also a video store kid. And of course, that's one of the big draws of Troma is that their covers are very eye-catching, especially to immature young teenage boys who are probably too young to watch a lot of that stuff, but watch it anyway. So I grew up on his films, and I was always thinking about Troma, and like a lot of other people from my generation also, I certainly watched the Toxic Crusaders, the cartoon series on Saturday morning cartoons in the early 90s. So Troma was in my head. Troma was in my soul. When I went to film school, I became very good friends with an older student who was doing a lot of work with Troma and was working on his own Troma film, and he introduced me to some of the people at Troma West. At that time, even though Troma is New York based, they had an LA office. It was Troma West, as I say. And I got to meet some of the people there and kind of hang out. And just, I was building my Troma connections. I was also, at the time in film school, working with a group of people called the Kids of Whitney High. It was a group of young adults with developmental disabilities in a rock band. And they ended up playing Warped Tour at one point. While I was working on a documentary about them, and I went to go film them where they were playing at Warped Tour, and somehow the stage they were on or how they came together was done through Troma, and there were all these Troma people there. There was one in particular named Doug Sackman, who was a Troma producer and kind of a lifelong Troma guy, and he and I became friendly, and I just became more and more enmeshed in the Troma world. Ultimately ended up showing one of our Kids of Whitney High videos at Troma Dance, which was counter-programming to Sundance, literally in the same location at the same time. It was actually started in a way by Trey Parker and Matt Stone kind of crashing the gates at Sundance one year and playing Cannibal the Musical, their first film, which ultimately did come out through Troma. And Lloyd just loved the idea so much that he has been doing that yearly with Troma Dance. And for years, it actually really did take place at the same time and in the same place as Sundance. They would kind of just set it up and do it. And when I was out there at Sundance and Troma Dance, I became very friendly with Lloyd there. That was when we were really interacting personally. And then from there, he travels around a lot to lecture. He travels around a lot for conventions and whatnot. I move around a lot. And we would just be crossing paths often, and we just kept becoming friendlier and friendlier as I started working on my pop culture history projects, I would often involve Lloyd because he's always good for an interview when he behaves himself. And he can be very funny and very charming and very outspoken. And he's been involved in so many different things that I was always able to kind of find a way to sneak in, if you will, a Lloyd Kaufman interview. And it was just my way of kind of giving back to this man and the company that had helped to rear me and my pop culture affinities when I was younger. Mm, And we just, stayed in touch and kind of were always figuring out ways of working together. And I became friendly with a lot of people in the Troma world. Doug Sackman, as I said, the guy who kind of helped me to get introduced into it a lot. He unfortunately passed away a year ago. We mentioned him in the book. I actually thought he was a lot older than I was. He's actually he was actually only a few months older than I. So I always kind of looked up to him as a bigger brother, kind of like an uncle, and a lot of people in the Troma world did. And everyone was very sad that he passed away last year at 43. So, there's a sense of family, there's a sense of collection, there's a sense of togetherness. I have, met people and stay friends with people through the Troma world. They would, some people probably would call it a cult. I mean, it really is. It's a very tight knit group of people, and it's growing all the time in different generations, and so it feels good to kind of be part of that world.
Lloyd Kaufman Interviews collects 28 interviews conducted between 1981 and 2023. How did the book come about? And was Lloyd maybe insulted that the Conversations with Filmmakers series did books on John Ford and Orson Welles before finally getting around to Lloyd Kaufman?
I'll answer the second part first. Lloyd was delighted when I told him that we were going to be able to do a Conversations with Filmmakers installment about him. Uh, I don't even think he thought about the fact that they had not done him yet in 25 years of just about every other filmmaker you can imagine. For me, I was shocked because I love the Conversation Filmmaker series, and I love most of the filmmakers that they have done their books on. Um, and I love these filmmakers I'm about to name, but I think they're kind of in the similar ballpark as Lloyd because they've done John Waters and they've done Roger Corman and they've done Russ Meyer, great filmmakers, but not Orson Welles and not John Ford. So I thought, and that's part of what I like about the Conversation with Filmmakers series. It's very eclectic. It's not just, Steven Spielberg and Francis Ford Coppola and Orson Welles and Charlie Chaplin. Like, it's a lot of different kinds of filmmakers. Ultimately, what had happened was as I said, a longtime reader of the Conversation with Filmmakers series ever since I was much younger. They also have two other series. They do the same thing with comic book people, and they do the same thing with authors, like David Foster Wallace and people like that. So I was a fan. And a few years ago, I was really feeling compelled to do a long form project on Lloyd and or on Troma. Lloyd's written a few of his own books. There's been a few other, projects and things about him. And there's been documentaries and stuff, kind of low budget things that have made or behind the scenes stuff. But there wasn't really, one solid, this is the story of Troma, this is the story of Lloyd in kind of this larger, more high profile level like that, aside from, again, some of the books that Lloyd wrote himself many years ago. Um, and around the same time, I was reading one of the Conversation with Filmmakers installments on the Iranian filmmaker Jafar Panahi, who is one of my favorite living filmmakers and has been for a long time. And in that book, the Jafar Panahi interviews, the editor, Drew Todd, um, mentioned who he had reached out to at University Press in Mississippi to get involved, Gerald Perry, who helped to kind of kickstart the entire series. And I just saw the name in Drew's introduction and said, I do what I do. I investigate and figure out how to get in touch with people. And I got in touch with Gerald Perry, and he was as nice as could be. And he loved the idea of seeing if we could do a Lloyd Kaufman installment. And he helped me get in touch with the people over there at University Press in Mississippi. It was a little bit of a road. I had to kind of really pitch hard, but we finally got it. And because at first they were a little, they weren't sure if they wanted to do a book on Lloyd Kaufman. But we made it work, and they've been great all the way through. I've really enjoyed working with the people at University Press of Mississippi. It's been almost 3 years. It is a university press, so it's limited resources and it's a bit smaller and that kind of thing than what I'm used to. So everything took a really long time. It was a very slow process. The book has actually been done for probably well over a year. It's just, they have so many that they do, and they kind of go through all these processes and all that kind of thing. So it's been long. I think I first started really thinking about this and reaching out to them probably May 3 years ago. So it's been almost 3 years since the whole process has taken place.
Yeah, as you're mentioning, it is a prestigious press and a prestigious series as well. I've always thought that Lloyd should have a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. I even mentioned it to him before, and he said, "Well, our fans are poor. It's not going to happen." That's just him pretending to be humble. But really, I think it could be used, this book and other things that have come out in recent years, maybe to kind of push the argument that he deserves such a thing.
Yeah, well, first of all, unfortunately, Lloyd being Lloyd, he's very outspoken and he speaks, everyone talks about, we should speak truth to power and all this. Lloyd not only does it and for real and dangerously so, but he's been doing it before people even understood terms like that. And that's a lot of what the interviews in my book show, is that he has never not been that way. It's not like he's some bitter old coot all these many years later. I mean, he came out of the gate on fire, and that's clearly why he is able to be so prolific. I mean, he's, getting to the eighth decade here. Troma's been around for over 5 decades, and the guy's got a lot of energy, and he uses that to tell his stories, but to also try to get his messages out there. A lot of respect for that, and that's what a lot of what you see in these interviews. And he does talk a lot about class inequity and issues of economics, which, for good or ill, for whatever reason, a lot of people don't talk about, at least not as directly in that regard. They talk about a lot of other social issues, but not really class ones, and Lloyd's very much about that. Um, so unfortunately, it does cost a lot to get the campaign going, to get somebody on, to get a star. You don't have to pay for the star itself. It's something like $35,000, I think. So it's difficult. Frankly, if Lloyd had that kind of money at his disposal, he would probably go and make another movie. But yeah, I honestly, a lot of what this is about and why I was so interested in doing this book is I wanted to do my part, whatever little bit I can do to help calcify Lloyd's legacy. Obviously, let's be honest, he's famous, he's an icon, he is somebody who people have at least heard of or know, or his films or whatnot, even if they're not into that kind of thing. But I just really wanted as much spotlight on him as a man, not even just a filmmaker, but as a man, and all the amazing things he's done, even besides the Toxic Avenger, besides his films. Lloyd's been extremely involved in the film industry in so many ways that most people probably don't know. And again, a lot of that comes out in the book. He found the stairs for Rocky. He found the discotheque in Saturday Night Fever. He found John Travolta's apartment for that film as well. He was the production coordinator and helped to produce My Dinner with Andre. You can watch My Dinner with Andre to the end. His name's in the credits as production coordinator, and there's a Troma logo at the end of it as well. It's partly a Troma film, which would shock a lot of people. And Lloyd's done all these things. Kirk Douglas for years would kind of bring Lloyd around on some of his sets and whatnot, the way that he sort of helped Stanley Kubrick get involved with Spartacus and kind of opened some doors for Lloyd, because Kirk Douglas, at peak Kirk Douglas, like when he was like, a little after Spartacus and all that stuff. He wanted Lloyd around to kind of help out, and not just as a PA, but really to help with the production and, some script development and that kind of thing. Lloyd came up at the same time as Stan Lee. Stan Lee and he were very close and wrote scripts together and were working together. And Stan Lee, even later on in life, would do intros and outros to some of the Troma films, and was very, a lot of crisscrossing with Lloyd Kaufman, and Marvel put out the original Toxic Avenger comic book series, and that kind of thing. So, there's a lot there, and I hope that this book can help to just get that out there so that people can understand that Lloyd Kaufman is more than just Toxic Avenger, more than just tits and ass and vomiting and shit and blood and all these kinds of things, that he is a very important part of not just our pop culture, but our culture. Uh, yeah, if it leads to somehow he can get his star finally, or any other kind of more prestigious awards that I think he deserves and a lot of people feel he deserves, then great. I would be very proud if that could happen with this humble little book.
Enjoying the show? Click like and subscribe.
Parenthetically, we were going to have Lloyd, and he had a surprise visit with his brother Charles in the restroom of a landmark New York restaurant. But I'll direct the question to Matthew. Despite Lloyd calling himself a dumb Jew, his Ivy League education comes up several times in the book. People might be surprised that some of his background and erudition created these gross, irreverent, outlandish movies. Are they perhaps missing something that's lurking beneath the schlocky surface?
Lloyd is very good at destroying the barrier between highbrow and lowbrow. I think that's a lot of what his work and his art and his legacy is about. We talk about in the book the first film he made as a young student, and he went to Yale, and a lot of people will be shocked about this too. He was not there for film. He wasn't even there for art. He was actually majoring in Chinese studies. He's always had a real fixation and interest in Asian culture. Was one of the first people to really utilize in the West, in the West and United States at least, feng shui for his office, for example, and the way that he would set up the Troma offices were done very much in the Asian mode, which, very shortly thereafter, probably not because of Lloyd, but just it caught on elsewhere, like in Silicon Valley with a lot of open space and everyone kind of see each other, and it allowed for more collaboration and things like that. So Lloyd was into that very early on. And his first film that he made was when he actually went to Africa. He spent a year in Chad as part of the Peace Corps, I believe. And he was doing some teaching and things like that. He literally took a year off from school. He shot with a little Bolex 60 millimeter, no sound camera, a group of villagers somewhere slaughtering a pig. Um, he brought it back and showed it to some of his family and friends, and he was really delighted by their response, which was a little bit of horror and a little bit of terror, but also fascination, the way that you would look at a car crash and that kind of thing. So right away, Lloyd was a provocateur, and Lloyd was utilizing cinema verite, and Lloyd was trying to tell a story about a unique group of people and being very brutal about it, very honest, and really showing the blood and guts and gore of life, the viscera that is there. So again, from the very beginning, Lloyd was breaking that barrier between art and horror and creativity and terror and reality and fiction and many of the things that he's done throughout his entire career. Uh, so how much of that comes from you have to know it before you can break it, that he had to be a very educated person? He didn't just go to Yale. He's talked about this for someone, again, who talks a lot about the working class and the underclass and, that kind of blue collar gutter world, the dive bars and everything else. He came up and he talks about it. He doesn't hide it. He came up in a very affluent society. His father was a very prominent lawyer, and he was right up there in the rich area of Manhattan. And he was very well educated even when he was younger. He got to go to all these different Broadway shows, and he got to travel and everything else. So even by the time he got to Yale, he was pretty well attuned to things just because he had a very privileged background, and his family was able to afford to do that. Maybe it was all that erudition, maybe it was all that education, maybe it was all that sophistication that allowed him to be, kind of like an F. Scott Fitzgerald type of a person, or Evelyn Waugh, or one of these people, or, Jane Austen, or people like that, who they kind of come from a very high profile, very privileged background, which allows them then to talk about things in a very irreverent, rebellious, proto-punk rock kind of way, and kind of make fun of society and kind of break it down, especially the richer society and the class structure and all those other kinds of things. And that's, it's true in all of his films, even, his more goofy, outlandish ones, including his earliest ones, which, most of his early films were sex comedies like Porky's. Except he was making his movies before Porky's came out. Like, he got there first also. But they all dealt with social issues, and they dealt with some really important messaging. I mean, he made a movie about these softball teams of girls, and there's TNA in it and bouncing around and all the other rest of it. It's late 60s, early 70s, it pays the bills. But he's also talking about feminism, and he's talking about equality, and he's even dealing with race issues and gender issues and sexuality issues in, a very silly, goofy sex comedy. So he's always put both in at the same time. And, I think it's just the kind of brain that he has, that he's able to be the Yaley, and, he can also, be the South Park guy. So people who really understand him and understand his films, I think, see that. I would not be surprised that this is a guy who has a lot on the ball.
The way you're describing him as well kind of sounds like the perennial Jewish insider outsider. So he's close enough to kind of the inner circles of high society, or, the elite class. He's close enough to critique it, never maybe feeling like he's a part of it fully, and I think a lot of his humor and a lot of his sensibility, even getting into the issues of social justice, which a lot of his films do, probably comes from his affluence, as you're saying.
Yet again, so that also comes out in the book, and something that a lot of people would probably be very surprised about is, the boy down the street from him was another filmmaker who was in a very similar kind of a place and holds a similar kind of a place in our culture today, even much more well known. So people will know who he is, but it's Oliver Stone. Uh, Lloyd and Oliver Stone more or less grew up together. They were boyhood friends. They both were at Yale at the same time. Their other classmate, that I don't think they were that close with, but probably saw him around, and I know that Oliver Stone has talked about this too, was a young man by the name of George W. Bush. So if you could imagine, at one time at Yale, there was George W. Bush, Oliver Stone, and Lloyd Kaufman all together. But Lloyd and Oliver were friends, and the way that Lloyd tells it, at least, you always have to take things a little bit, as a grain of salt with Lloyd, but uh, Oliver wanted to be a novelist, and it wasn't until he started kind of hanging out with Lloyd and his group of film friends, because Lloyd really started getting into film in college, even though he was going to college for Chinese studies and was doing a lot of other things. He started meeting film people on campus, and he got involved with film societies on campus and just completely fell in love with it. And his passion for it and starting to make films. I mean, he was making movies, not just, short little documentaries about people killing pigs. He was making actual films, sophomore, junior year of college. And through some of his background and through some of the other people at Yale, he was, to his credit, you can complain all you want, rich kids, whatever. He was able to get some money together, and he was able to make it work. And he was able to make, these little films. And Oliver saw this. And again, the way Lloyd tells it, Oliver Stone started getting into film himself. And it is true that Oliver's first credits are as associate producer and actor in a couple of early Lloyd Kaufman films. So that can't be denied. I mean, he did get his start technically with Lloyd. This was before Troma was his thing, but Lloyd did technically give Oliver Stone his start. And in fact, I can't remember the exact name. I think it's Seizure, but Oliver Stone's very first feature film, some underground film nobody's ever heard of or seen. I don't know if it ever even got released in any real way, but it ends with an exclamation point. And a lot of Lloyd's early films also had exclamation points at the end. So Lloyd absolutely influenced Oliver Stone to the extent that Lloyd says it's always hard to tell. We'd have to ask Oliver. Yeah, so that makes sense. So anybody who would look at an Oliver Stone film, especially his more political ones, obviously, like JFK or Nixon, or even his film on George W. Bush, his old Yale classmate, knows that he's very good at understanding those elite worlds and understanding the mechanism behind them and how it works at the very top, while also understanding not only the content of the underground and the content of the rebellion and the content of the protests and whatnot, but he's able to meld the kind of art forms and filmmaking behind that also. He can make these films that are operatic and beautiful and lush and grand and in the style of, these great old period pieces from the 1940s and 50s and 60s and whatnot. And then he can also, in the same movie, sometimes in the same shots, make them very cartoonish or silly or goofy or over the top or horrific, or again, very punk rock, very DIY. I mean, I think the best example of that is something like Natural Born Killers. I mean, that is what that movie is. It's like all of film coming together at the same time, all of culture coming together at the same time. And to do that correctly, someone like Oliver Stone has to be very understanding of the highest of the highs and opera and the lowest of the lows and, just, hobo music off in a field somewhere or something like that. And I think Lloyd is very much, in that same camp.
Speaking of camp, which looms kind of large in this larger conversation, what place do you think humor plays in Lloyd's life and work?
Everything. Lloyd absolutely looks up to Charlie Chaplin, and he absolutely looks up to Mel Brooks, particularly Charlie Chaplin, though. And Mel Brooks would probably say the same thing, that he also looks up to Charlie Chaplin. Particularly a movie like The Great Dictator, I think is a really good example that would clearly be a big inspiration on Mel Brooks, but also very much on Lloyd, because that is what Charlie Chaplin did. And, that was what really good vaudeville did. And that was what really good early films of that period did do, was because they were for people who were on the outskirts. It was kind of like the groundlings thing. And it was people who really needed that kind of uplift and that kind of entertainment and wanted to see themselves represented and wanted to see the higher classes getting poked fun at and the powers that be getting taken down a notch. I mean, that's what all really great comedy and maybe some would say even art is about, is bringing down some of those forces that are making us feel like we're being brought down. And Lloyd is very much of that school also. He, in his interviews in the book, he's always talking about Charlie Chaplin. Um, and that's, I think, why we appreciate Chaplin so much. Particularly because we know how directly involved he was, even in issues that might not have touched him completely personally, but that he felt were important. It's no big revelation that even though he wasn't Jewish, his half brother Sid was, and that Sid was one of the people that didn't want Charlie to do The Great Dictator and didn't want Charlie to become too political. But Charlie couldn't help himself. He really had to do that, very much like Lloyd. That's one of the things that I really hope comes out of this book, and that before Lloyd is gone, or at least after he is, that his legacy holds some aspect of, even in his goofiest, craziest, goriest, most disgusting films and art that he's done over the last decades, like more than half a century, there's always message behind it. There's always something he is trying to say. He's always trying to make a point or a few points. He's often very ahead of the game. And the Toxic Avenger again is a really great example of that. It's goofy, it's farts and burps and blood and guts and tits and ass and monsters and all different kinds of things. But let's be honest, it's one of the first movies to really deal with environmentalism. They weren't really talking about it back then. Earth Day had just started. They weren't really talking about conservationism. Most people didn't know what toxic waste was. People weren't talking about pollution like that, on a larger level. And Lloyd wanted to make this goofy, fun, crazy movie, but he also wanted to make these points. I mean, a lot of the movie came from him reading about, the problem with toxic waste and, okay, how can he get more people to understand what's going on there? You can make a documentary, you can write an article, you can write a book, you can go and talk on it, or you can make this goofy, crazy, over the top, silly, kind of anti-superhero movie, if you will, the way Lloyd did, and it worked. And he kept going. And that's what he does. So the humor helps make the message more palatable, very much the way Charlie Chaplin did, and that Mel Brooks talks about in a lot of his interviews in life too. That he sees it kind of the same way. That's what Springtime for Hitler was all about. Was, I'm going to get back at Hitler by making fun of him. And as we all know, Mel Brooks was in the army. I mean, he was really part of that. I mean, so he had a personal connection to that. So he's not just playing around. He's like, he really hated Hitler. You know what I mean? He had a personal grudge against him, way beyond just, hey, I'm Jewish and the Holocaust. It's like he had to be in war and deal with that. So how is he going to get back at Hitler? Well, he's going to make fun of him forever. And that's an important way of doing it, and makes discussions like that happen decades after the producers came out. So that's a lot of what Lloyd aspires to do. So the humor helps with that. It allows people to talk about things they maybe wouldn't talk about otherwise. And Lloyd has done that in all of his films. All of his films have that.
Well, looking back on the interviews and 50 years of independent filmmaking, how would you describe the Troma style?
Definitely meta. Another one of Lloyd's big influences that he talks about often is Bertolt Brecht, who really helped to popularize the idea of a more interactive, relatable theater and to find ways of connecting the audience to what was going on stage, breaking the fourth wall in the ways that they did it and being more meta in that regard. So Lloyd talks a lot about the Brechtian quality of his films, and you could see it there. And in his regard, it would be even showing where the seams are and showing where the breaks are, very much the way that Andy Warhol, yet another big influence on Lloyd, did, very intentionally. It's also, frankly, very cost effective. So when someone's head gets smashed, and you could see this in the behind the scenes of a lot of the films that are being made, he'll make sure, and he talks about this with the editing and whatnot, he'll make sure he wants you to see that it's a watermelon at the last moment before the hammer comes down. He wants people to see that, no, it's a dummy that got thrown off the side of the building, not the person. He wants to involve the audience because A, it's funny and it's a little shocking and it kind of reminds people that they're watching a movie, but B, it lets people in on the filmmaking. It makes it very relatable. It makes it very like, hey, come over here. You're part of this. You're part of the game here. And you know what we're doing here. And you know that we are, having a good time here, even if somebody is dying horribly or someone's head is being smashed, even if it's a little kid or something like that. It creates a really interesting connection that he brings back to people like Brecht, and I believe him because, and again, that goes back to his education and his background and growing up as an affluent New York City kid. So that all comes into these films. So that's a big part of it. Is they're Brechtian, they're very meta, they're very DIY, they're very punk or proto-punk, very rebellious, not only in the content but in the style. And yet at the same time, there always is that highbrow aspect. There always is a real sophistication where it's not just jackass. It's not just burps and farts and giggles and goofs, that he is creating a real narrative. And I think not all of them, some of the movies I like less than others, but many of Lloyd's films and many of the Troma films are pretty well structured and are pretty well written and are pretty consistent in their vision and have a certain clean quality to them where it it you can tell it's not just people who didn't have a lot of money or didn't care or just wanted to move on to the next thing. You can tell that there's a lot of intention in the films that they make. And again, you could see this in the behind the scenes documentaries that exist, and people can watch this on Troma's streaming service, Troma Now, or in the box sets for the DVDs and that kind of thing. That's why Lloyd makes them. There's like a behind the scenes documentary about I think every movie that Lloyd's made in the last like 10 or 20 years or something like that, because he wants to let people in on what they're doing. That's part of the film, is the context of the film. I would recommend anybody who's seen a Troma film to watch some of the behind the scenes films, and then watch those films again, and you'll kind of get a better sense of what's going on. There's like an outside quality to the film that you might not see unless you see the behind the scenes stuff. Like you have to see like the people working the wires and stuff, because that's, in a way, it's kind of part of the movie. And Lloyd's very, very, very good at that. And that comes from intention, consistency, and getting sometimes 100 or more people at once to all be thinking and doing the same thing, even if it is exploding shit or monsters fighting with each other, or girls naked mud wrestling in a field somewhere or something like that. Like you can tell that there's a lot of intentionality and there's a lot of vision that is shared, and that takes a lot of sophistication. That takes a lot of professionalism, a lot of prowess, a lot of education, a lot of understanding, even if there's not a lot of money, not a lot of time, And most of the people who work on Troma films have absolutely no idea what they're doing. They're just there. But Lloyd has to kind of corral them together and get them to become a machine. And he does that every single time. So what is a Troma style? What is a Troma film? It's, I think rightly so. It's like the definition of pornography or obscenity. You'll know it when you see it. As soon as you have a Troma film on, even one of the ones that Lloyd didn't make, you can almost immediately go, oh, that's a Troma movie. I think even more so than you would say, oh, that's a Stuart Gordon film, or that's a Roger Corman film, or that's a Russ Meyer film. There is just an ineffable quality to Troma films that are there. And I think it is ineffable. And I think it is just present without being in your face because Lloyd and his team really, at the end of the day, when they're together, maybe individually, not so much, when they're together, they really know what they're doing. And you can see that behind the scenes stuff.
Hate to pin you down, but we'd love to have your recommendations on the record. Mathew, what are your top 3 favorite Troma movies?
Well, it's in the book too, because I know everybody you keep asking me, but number 1 is absolutely the very great Mother's Day. Mother's Day is fantastic. Lloyd actually didn't really have much to do with it. His brother, Charles Kaufman, he was a filmmaker also at one point. He also worked on a lot of cartoons. He was a writer, and no irony. I really think that it's a fantastic, amazing film. And I think it really falls into what we've been talking about here, where it's very smart and it's very stupid at the same time. It says a lot, and there's a lot going on, and it's very cleverly made. It is lowbrow, and it is gritty and dirty and has a very Texas Chainsaw Massacre quality to it. Also, they're very beautiful at the same time. Just the shots he gets and the way the camera moves, and the silence and the atmospheres and the world that he builds and these characters that he creates. You see that very much in Mother's Day. It is like one of those great 70s horror films, even though it came out a little bit later, like right on the heels of that, um, where it's dark and beautiful at the same time. It's scary and strange and odd and awkward and just makes you feel uncomfortable watching it. But at the same time, it's in parts very funny. It's in parts very smart. Uh, and for my money, I've said it before, I really feel it's true. It definitely has probably the best opening sequence of any horror film I've ever seen. I would say it's one of the best opening sequences of any film ever. It's one of the things I love about Mother's Day. It has a really incredible opening sequence that I feel like I could teach an entire film class semester on, because there's so much that happens, and it opens up the film so well, and it introduces the characters, and without saying too much, it's almost like its almost standalone short film, and it's got a great trajectory of where it's going and what it's doing. As the audience, and there's the meta Brechtian quality again, as the audience, you kind of shift gears at a point. Like, you suddenly start to realize, it's almost like the unreliable narrator. You suddenly start to realize at a point, wait a second, the predator might be the prey and vice versa. And that and I'm still not giving too much away. I just want to intrigue people who might think that I'm kidding, or like, oh, Mother's Day, that sounds stupid, or I saw a trailer for it, the poster looks kind of goofy or whatever. It's a very smart, very well made film. The other two is, obviously, you got to see the Toxic Avenger. You got to see the original Toxic Avenger. I've been lucky enough to see the reboot that's finally coming out, that Macon Blair has become a friend made as well, and it's great, and it is also completely different. It's almost night and day, but a lot of the same ideas and themes, and the general narrative is similar, but it's its own movie, and Lloyd wanted that to be the case, and Macon, the filmmaker, wanted that to be the case. Clearly, Legendary, the company that ended up financing it and getting it going, wanted that as well. So it's a fun movie, but if you're gonna start getting interested in Troma, you got to start from scratch, and you got to see the Toxic Avenger. It's not the first Troma film. It's not Lloyd's first film. But it, very much like Mother's Day, kind of brings together all the different elements that we've been talking about, and a lot of the things that come up in the book, and so much else that comes up in the rest of the Troma movies. Of it's high, it's low, there's messages, it's dealing with important issues. There's a lot of elements of Frankenstein in it. And Lloyd's talked about that before too. It is the idea of the hero is a monster, and he's a disgusting monster that you don't really want to look at. And Lloyd was very cautious about making sure that the Toxic Avenger looked disgusting. He didn't want him to be, too cute. He wanted him to be disgusting. And that made him more of a powerful hero, especially for, again, the working class, for the misfits, for the underclass, somebody who is really out there. Very much, again, like the tramp from Chaplin's movies. These are themes and elements of the Jew. These are themes and elements of what it means to be Jewish, where we can be very smart and very hardworking and be wanting to do good and wanting to be part of a better world and wanting to build toward that and wanting to use our given talents and abilities and heritage to make that happen. And yet at the same time, we get placed in these situations where, we get flummoxed and we get knocked down and we get, batted around and even caricatured or made to look like we're the bad guys or made to look like, we are quite literally the outsiders, the foreigner. I mean, I'm sure you guys know there's even elements of that it's said in the vampire mythos and in the idea of Dracula and the idea of vampires. And that's why, putting up a crucifix gets them away, and elements of spices and garlics and such, and the whole Eastern European thing. Hey, it's these parasites that are coming in. They're sucking our blood. They're taking our women. I mean, there's a lot of element of anti-Semitism in the early vampire mythos if you read into it that way. And there's some people who feel that that is absolutely true. I don't know how true that really is directly, but you could see some of that, and I can understand how that could be the case. So we as Jews have often been put in the place of the monster, but there's a lot to feel victimized about as well and to feel bad about as well. So there's connections to that. And I think that's why a lot of Jewish people like myself and Lloyd feel connection to monsters and feel connections to people of, are they really monsters? Or is that just what the village is saying about them because they don't like this outsider there? They don't like this foreign element there, and they've made them into a monster. I mean, that's what the whole theme of Wicked is. And I think that's why a lot of people are connecting with Wicked. Is the Wicked Witch from the West really a witch? Is she really a bad person? Is she really a monster, a villain? Or is she just being painted that way? And really, she's just an outsider. She's different. And people can't handle that. So I think these things are all connected. The Toxic Avenger, Chaplin's the Tramp, Frankenstein, being Jewish, being that kind of always outsider, always misfit, but having these special talents, having these special abilities. We see it even in something like Superman, which makes sense. The two Jewish boys have come up with Superman. He is the alien. He doesn't know how to control his strength necessarily. He doesn't know what he's doing with all this stuff. He just knows he has it and he wants to make the world a better place. But he could be just as destructive by accident or seen that way by the wrong element or the wrong media that might be looking at him wrong. That's what X-Men is about. That's what a lot of these stories and characters are about that have a lot to do with, on the other side, Jewish people. You have your Jack Kirby's and your Stan Lee's and your Chris Claremonts and, various other people like that who are dealing with these topics of the outsider, of the monster, of how this all connects. And Lloyd is absolutely bringing this all together in the movies that he makes and in the interviews that he talks about. My third one will just be one title, and that is Toxic Avenger 4.
I've often heard that many people think that's the best one.
It is very good, and Lloyd himself would say, just because the way they end up getting cut and the way that certain things happen with some of the financing and so forth, Toxic Avenger 2 and 3 are worth watching if you're very interested in the Toxic Avenger world and you want to kind of be a completist and whatnot. But let's just say Toxic Avenger 4 opens with Stan Lee doing the introduction and quite literally basically telling you don't need to watch 2 or 3. And in fact, kind of this is the real sequel to the Toxic Avenger. It's Toxic Avenger 4. So they kind of apologize for 2 and 3 in 4. And I think that it's kind of serious. I won't go into it to too much detail here, and some of it's in the book. But yeah, 2 and 3 kind of became a bit of a mess, including it actually was one movie that was so long, they broke it up into 2 pieces. And let's just say you could definitely tell, like a lot of 3 is recycled from 2, and it kind of doesn't make sense in some places because of that. And it can feel very repetitive and kind of boring, and it's kind of just like a reworking of part 2. So that's kind of how bad 2 and 3 are. And it's unfortunate, but we are blessed to have part 4, which also James Gunn helped to write, when James Gunn was kind of in the scene still. So
All right. Well, thank you so much, Mathew, for joining us again.
thank you guys for having me on. And yeah, Lloyd Kaufman Interviews is out through University Press of Mississippi on February 17th, paperback and hardcover, as well as ebook. It is a university press. So I don't know how out there it's going to be, but it should be at bookstores everywhere in one way or another. Or you can, order it on Amazon or wherever else, or through the University Press of Mississippi. Yes, thank you.
And to our audience, now back to your regularly scheduled lives.
Amusing Jews is here to amuse you. If you like being amused, go ahead and click like and subscribe.